The fading sunset cast long shadows across the dusty street of Green River, Wyoming, as Penelope Vance frantically gathered the scattered papers that had blown from her hands, tears staining her bruised cheek. It was 1875, and the Wyoming Territory still held the rugged promise of freedom that had drawn her family west 3 years prior, a promise that now felt as hollow as the abandoned mine shafts dotting the nearby hills. Blood trickled from her split lip as she knelt in the dirt, her trembling fingers fumbling with the pages of sheet music she taught from. The townsfolk passing by averted their eyes, pretending not to notice the fresh bruises blooming beneath her right eye or the way she winced when moving her left arm. Everyone knew what had happened, but no one dared speak of it. Harold Blackburn was too powerful in Green River for anyone to cross him, especially over a mere music teacher's refusal of his proposal. "You'll change your mind," Harold had sneered earlier that afternoon, his meaty fist still clenched after the final blow. "No one refuses me. Especially not some penniless orphan playing at respectability." Penelope had remained silent, tasting copper on her tongue as she stared back at him with quiet defiance. At 22, she had already survived too much to be broken by a man like Harold Blackburn, no matter how wealthy or connected his family might be. A shadow fell across her as she reached for the last sheet of music, and Penelope instinctively recoiled, expecting another confrontation. Instead, a weathered but gentle hand reached down, plucking the paper from the ground before the wind could claim it again. "Madam," the deep voice said softly, "you dropped this." Penelope looked up, squinting against the setting sun to see a tall figure silhouetted against the fiery sky. As her vision adjusted, she made out a man she'd never seen before, lean and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. Dust covered his riding clothes, and the Stetson perched on his dark hair had seen better days. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper as she accepted the paper with shaking fingers. The stranger's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, the bruises, the torn sleeve of her dress, the way she held her left arm protectively against her body. Something dangerous flickered in his expression, quickly replaced by a careful neutrality. "Need help getting somewhere?" he asked, keeping a respectful distance. Penelope's instinct was to refuse. Men's help always came with expectations, with debt to be paid. But as she tried to stand, pain shot through her ribs and she faltered. The stranger didn't move to touch her, simply waiting with the patience of a man used to wild things. "I'm heading to the boarding house," she finally admitted. "Mrs. Holloway's just down the street." He nodded once. "I'll walk with you if that's agreeable. Been on the trail a while and could use some directions to a decent meal myself." It was a kindness, she realized, offering help without making her feel like charity. Penelope nodded, clutching her papers to her chest as they began walking slowly down the street. "I'm Asher Zimmerman," he said after they'd walked a few paces in silence. "Just arrived from Colorado." "Penelope Vance," she replied, keeping her eyes forward. "I teach music at the school." They continued in comfortable silence until they reached the white-painted boarding house with its neat picket fence and well-tended garden. As they approached the steps, the front door flew open, and Mrs. Holloway, a stout woman with iron-gray hair and a permanently worried expression, rushed out. "Penelope, oh my stars, girl, look at you." The older woman hurried down the steps, shooting an accusatory glance at Asher before realizing he wasn't the cause of Penelope's injuries. "That Blackburn boy did this, didn't he? I heard he proposed, and when you said no, Mrs. Holloway, please," Penelope interrupted, her cheeks flushing with humiliation. "I'd rather not discuss it on the street." The landlady pursed her lips but nodded, finally noticing Asher properly. "And who might you be, sir?" "Just passing through, madam," Asher replied, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "Helped Miss Vance carry her things." Mrs. Holloway's expression softened slightly. "Well, that's decent of you. We're full up for rooms, I'm afraid, but Sullivan's place down by the livery has beds if you're looking." Asher nodded. "Much obliged." He turned to Penelope, his expression serious. "Miss Vance, I hope you feel better soon." As he turned to leave, Penelope found her voice again. "Mr. Zimmerman." He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Thank you," she said simply. Something in his eyes warmed slightly, and he touched the brim of his hat again before continuing down the street, his long strides carrying him away. Mrs. Holloway clucked her tongue, gently ushering Penelope inside. "Let's get you cleaned up, child. Whatever did you say to make that beast hit you so?" Penelope sighed, wincing as she climbed the steps. "I simply told him I couldn't marry a man I didn't love." "Love," Mrs. Holloway snorted, though there was sympathy in her eyes. "In these parts, girl, that's a luxury few can afford. Especially not an orphan music teacher," Penelope finished wearily. "Yes, I'm well aware of my circumstances, Mrs. Holloway." Inside the parlor, the landlady helped Penelope to a chair before disappearing to fetch water and bandages. Penelope sat in the fading light, the events of the day washing over her in waves of pain and humiliation. She had known refusing Harold would have consequences. His family practically owned half the businesses in town, but she hadn't expected such public violence. What troubled her most was not the physical pain, but the knowledge that tomorrow she would face her students with these visible marks of shame. The children would whisper, and their parents would debate whether a woman who incited such violence was fit to teach their impressionable young ones. 3 years of building a respectable life in Green River might unravel because she had dared to claim the right to her own heart. Mrs. Holloway returned with a basin of water, clean cloths, and her prized jar of arnica salve. As the older woman gently cleaned Penelope's face, she spoke in a low, worried voice. "The Blackburns don't take kindly to public refusal, girl. Harold's father sits on the town council and the school board. They could make things very difficult for you. What would you have me do?" Penelope asked, wincing as the cloth touched her split lip. "Marry a man who would do this the first time I disagreed with him." Mrs. Holloway sighed heavily. "No, child. No decent woman should tie herself to such a man, but perhaps it would be best if you considered a position elsewhere. I have a cousin in Laramie who—" "I won't be driven from my home," Penelope interrupted, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "I've worked too hard to establish myself here. My students need me." The landlady's weathered face creased with concern. "Your courage does you credit, Penelope, but there's a difference between courage and foolishness. The Blackburns have destroyed people for less." Later, alone in her small room at the top of the stairs, Penelope stood before the mirror examining the damage. The bruises would fade, but the memory of Harold's face contorted with rage at her refusal would not. She had seen that same possessive fury in her father's eyes when he would beat her mother, claiming it was love that drove him to such measures. Love should never hurt like this, she thought, gingerly touching the swelling beneath her eye. Whatever this was, pride, ownership, control, it wasn't love. As she changed into her nightgown, careful of her injured ribs, Penelope found herself thinking of the stranger Asher Zimmerman and the quiet respect in his eyes. There had been anger there too, but not directed at her. It was strange to meet a man who seemed genuinely troubled by her pain without immediately trying to use it as a way to indebt her to him. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of her father's rage, Harold's sneering face, and, puzzlingly, storm gray eyes watching from a distance. Morning brought fresh pain but also renewed determination. Penelope dressed carefully in her most severe black dress, pinned her auburn hair tightly at the nape of her neck, and applied a thin layer of powder to mask the worst of the bruising. There was nothing to be done about her swollen lip or the way she moved stiffly, but she could at least attempt dignity. Breakfast in Mrs. Holloway's dining room was an uncomfortable affair. The other boarder's two elderly sisters, a railway clerk, and a young shop girl stared openly at Penelope's injuries before quickly averting their eyes when she met their gaze. No one mentioned what had happened, but their silence spoke volumes. "I've prepared a cold compress for you to take to school," Mrs. Holloway said quietly as Penelope prepared to leave. "If the swelling gets too painful, dear." Penelope thanked her, genuinely touched by the woman's concern, before gathering her music sheets and stepping out into the bright morning sunshine. The walk to the schoolhouse normally took only 10 minutes, but today, each step was an exercise in endurance. Halfway there, she heard the clatter of hooves behind her and tensed, stepping closer to the boardwalk's edge to allow the rider to pass. Instead, the horse slowed, and a familiar voice called out, "Miss Vance." She turned carefully to see Asher Zimmerman astride a magnificent chestnut gelding. He looked different in the morning light, more substantial somehow, less like a trail-worn drifter and more like a man with purpose. His clothes, while still practical, were cleaner, and he'd clearly taken the time to shave. "Mr. Zimmerman," she acknowledged, nodding slightly. He studied her face, his expression unreadable. "You're heading to the school?" "Yes, my students will be waiting." Something like admiration flickered in his eyes. "That's a fair walk in your condition. Would you accept a ride?" "I promise to keep to the main street where plenty of folks can see us." The offer was tempting. Her ribs ached abominably, but Penelope hesitated. "That's very kind, but it might cause talk, and I've had quite enough of that already." Asher's mouth quirked in a half-smile that transformed his serious face. "Miss Vance, I suspect you're going to cause talk regardless, walking into that schoolhouse looking like you've gone 10 rounds with a mountain cat." He paused, his expression sobering. "Proud as your decision might be, there's no sense adding physical suffering to what you're already enduring." Put that way, Penelope found herself reconsidering. "I suppose you're right." He dismounted in one fluid motion and approached, leading the horse. "May I help you up?" She nodded, and he placed his hands carefully at her waist, lifting her with surprising gentleness onto the saddle. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her body that had nothing to do with her injuries. Once she was settled, Asher took the reins and began leading the horse down the street, walking alongside rather than mounting behind her. "You're new to Green River," Penelope observed, trying to distract herself from the curious stares of passers-by. "Just arrived yesterday," he confirmed. "Though I've been through before." "Are you planning to stay long?" There was a brief hesitation before he answered. "That depends on several things." Something in his tone made Penelope glance down at him more carefully. The sun caught the silver threads in his otherwise dark hair, suggesting he was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years spent in harsh weather, and a thin white scar traced from his left temple to his jawline. His right hand rested casually near his hip where, she now noticed, a holstered revolver hung. "You're not just passing through, are you, Mr. Zimmerman?" she asked quietly. Those gray eyes met hers directly. "Everyone's just passing through somewhere, Miss Vance." Before she could press further, they arrived at the schoolhouse. Children were already gathering in the yard, their excited chatter dying down as they spotted their teacher arriving on horseback with a strange man. Asher reached up to help her dismount, his hand steady and impersonal this time as he set her gently on the ground. "Thank you," Penelope said, painfully aware of the small audience watching their every move. Asher touched the brim of his hat. "My pleasure, Miss Vance." He turned to go, then paused. "What time do your lessons end today?" 3 o'clock, she replied, surprised by the question. He nodded once. "I'll be by to see you home safely." Before she could protest, he was mounting his horse and riding away, leaving Penelope staring after him in confusion. It wasn't until little Sarah Turner tugged at her skirt that she realized she'd been standing motionless for several seconds. "Miss Vance," the child said, her eyes wide as she took in her teacher's bruised face. "Did somebody hit you?" Penelope knelt carefully, bringing herself to the girl's level. "Yes, Sarah. Sometimes adults make very bad decisions when they are angry, but I'm going to be fine." "Was it that mean Mr. Blackburn?" Sarah asked, her childish directness cutting straight to the truth. "Pa says he thinks he owns everybody 'cause his family's rich." "It's not polite to gossip about others," Penelope said gently, though her heart warmed at the girl's protective indignation. "Now, shall we begin our lessons? I believe today we were going to learn a new song." The morning passed in a blur of sympathetic glances from the older students and barely concealed whispers. By noon, Penelope's head was pounding in rhythm with the pain in her ribs, but she maintained her composure, refusing to let Harold Blackburn's violence disrupt her students' education. It was during the lunch hour, as the children played in the yard, and Penelope sat at her desk trying to eat a few bites of bread, that the school board chairman, Maxwell Blackburn, entered the classroom. Harold's father was a tall, imposing man with the same heavy build as his son, though his violence was typically financial and political rather than physical. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice deceptively mild as he removed his hat. "I understand there was an unfortunate incident yesterday." Penelope set down her bread, folding her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. "If by incident you mean your son assaulting me in broad daylight for declining his proposal, then yes, Mr. Blackburn, there was." The older man's jaw tightened at her directness. "My son can be impetuous. His feelings for you are obviously quite strong. Strong feelings do not justify violence, sir." Maxwell Blackburn paced slowly around the classroom, running a finger along the edge of a student's desk. "No, perhaps not, but they might explain it." He turned to face her directly. "Harold is prepared to overlook your reluctance, Miss Vance. He still wishes to marry you." A chill ran down Penelope's spine. "I believe I made my answer quite clear." "Indeed you did. And now I am here to explain the consequences of that answer." His voice hardened. "The school board will be meeting this evening to discuss your continued employment. There are concerns that a teacher who provokes such public confrontation may not be the proper moral influence for impressionable children." Penelope stood, ignoring the pain the sudden movement caused. "I provoked nothing except a man's wounded pride by exercising my right to decide my own future." "A noble sentiment," Blackburn said dismissively. "But this is the frontier, Miss Vance. Practical considerations must outweigh romantic notions of independence. My son can provide for you. He can protect you. In this territory, a woman alone is always vulnerable." "As your son so effectively demonstrated," Penelope replied bitterly. Something dangerous flashed in the older man's eyes. "Careful, Miss Vance. You're already in a precarious position. I would advise you to consider Harold's offer more carefully. By tomorrow, you may find yourself without employment or references. How long do you think you'll maintain your precious independence then?" He placed his hat back on his head and moved toward the door, pausing on the threshold. "Harold will call on you this evening. I suggest you receive him with more grace than you showed yesterday." After he left, Penelope sank back into her chair, her entire body trembling. The threat was clear: marry Harold or lose everything she had worked for. The injustice of it burned like acid in her throat, but she had no illusions about her position. In a town where the Blackburns controlled the economy and the local government, what chance did she have? The afternoon lessons were a testament to Penelope's self-control. Despite her turmoil, she led the children through their arithmetic and reading, even managing to teach them the promised new song on the small piano in the corner. If her voice sometimes faltered or her hands shook as she played, the children were kind enough not to mention it. At 3 o'clock, as the last student departed with a shy hug that made Penelope's ribs scream in protest, she gathered her things slowly, dreading the walk back to the boarding house and the confrontation that awaited her there. She was so lost in thought that the sound of boots on the wooden floor startled her. "Miss Vance." Asher Zimmerman stood in the doorway, hat in hand. True to his word, he had returned to escort her home. In the confined space of the schoolroom, he seemed larger somehow, his presence filling the small building. Penelope noted absently that in addition to the revolver at his hip, he now wore a deputy's badge. "You're the law now?" she asked, surprised. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Temporarily. Sheriff Hollies needed help and I needed a job. It seems we suited each other." "That was quick. I have experience," he said simply, offering no further explanation. His eyes narrowed as he studied her face. "You're in more pain than this morning." It wasn't a question, but Penelope answered anyway. "I had a visitor at lunch, Maxwell Blackburn." Asher's expression darkened. "What did he want?" "To inform me that I either marry his son or lose my position." Penelope laughed bitterly, wincing at the pain the sound caused. "Apparently, I'm a poor moral influence for provoking yesterday's attack." Asher's hands tightened on his hat. "That's not right." "No," Penelope agreed, gathering her books and papers, "but it's reality. Mr. Blackburn sits on the school board, the town council, and holds the mortgages on half the businesses in town. His word is practically law in Green River." "Not actual law," Asher said quietly, a dangerous edge to his voice. Penelope studied him curiously. "You seem to have strong feelings about this, Mr. Zimmerman, for a man who only arrived yesterday." He met her gaze steadily. "I've seen what happens when money buys immunity from consequences. It's why I'm here." Before she could question him further, he changed the subject. "Harold Blackburn is planning to call on you tonight, according to his father," Penelope confirmed, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. "I suppose he thinks after a day to consider my precarious position, I'll be more amenable to his proposal." "And will you be?" Asher asked, his voice neutral. Penelope straightened her shoulders despite the pain. "No, I'd rather leave Green River than marry a man who would treat me as property." Something like approval flickered in Asher's eyes. "Then perhaps we should discuss alternatives." They walked back to the boarding house together, Asher insisting on carrying her books and adjusting his long stride to accommodate her slower pace. Along the way, he asked carefully measured questions about her life in Green River, her teaching, and how she had come to the Wyoming Territory. Penelope found herself answering more openly than she normally would with a near stranger, perhaps because he listened with such genuine interest. "My parents died when our wagon train was caught in a flash flood crossing the Laramie River," she explained as they approached Mrs. Holloway's. "I was 19 and traveling west with them to start a new life after my father lost our farm in Illinois. The Holloways took me, and Mr. Holloway was still alive then and helped me secure the teaching position since I had some education." "And no other family?" Asher asked. Penelope shook her head. None that would claim me. My father was not well liked even among his own relatives. Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended, because Asher's expression softened with understanding. Some men don't deserve the families they have, he said quietly. They reached the boarding house steps, and Penelope turned to face him. Thank you for escorting me, Deputy Zimmerman. It was unnecessary but kind. It wasn't entirely selfless, he admitted. I wanted to speak with you privately. He glanced around, then lowered his voice. I believe Harold Blackburn will come tonight, and I doubt he'll take another refusal peacefully. A shiver ran through Penelope. I've considered that. I'd like to be present when he arrives. Penelope blinked in surprise. Here, in Mrs. Holloway's parlor, if you'll allow it. As a deputy, I have cause to investigate yesterday's assault. Harold's father will never let any charges stand, Penelope said, shaking her head. Perhaps not, Asher conceded, but my presence might prevent further harm. Penelope considered his offer. Having a lawman present might indeed discourage Harold from more violence, but it could also provoke him further, especially if he'd been drinking. And yet, the thought of facing Harold alone made her stomach clench with fear. Mrs. Holloway might object to a male visitor in the evening, she hedged. A smile touched Asher's lips. I've already spoken with her. She seems quite eager for my official presence during young Mr. Blackburn's call. Penelope couldn't help returning his smile, though it hurt her split lip. Then I accept your offer, Deputy. Harold typically makes his social calls around 7. I'll be here at 6:30, he promised, touching the brim of his hat before handing back her books. As she watched him walk away, Penelope felt something unexpected, a small flicker of hope, where before there had been only resignation and fear. The hours until evening passed with excruciating slowness. Penelope declined dinner with the other boarders, unable to face their curious stares again. Instead, she sat in her room, attempting to lose herself in a book of poetry while ignoring the growing dread in her stomach. At 6:15, she changed into her best dress, a simple blue cotton with white lace at the collar, and repinned her hair, trying not to wince as her fingers brushed against the tender spots on her scalp where Harold had grabbed her. She had just descended the stairs when a knock came at the front door. Mrs. Holloway, who had been hovering anxiously in the hallway, hurried to answer it, revealing Asher standing on the porch. He had exchanged his dusty trail clothes for a clean white shirt and dark vest, though he still wore the deputy's badge and his holstered revolver. Deputy Zimmerman, Mrs. Holloway greeted him with obvious relief. Do come in. Penelope is just preparing to receive visitors in the parlor. Asher stepped inside, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. When he saw Penelope on the stairs, something flickered in his eyes that made her heart beat a little faster. Miss Vance, he said simply, inclining his head. Deputy, she replied, descending the final steps. Punctual as promised. They moved into the parlor, where Mrs. Holloway had lit the lamps and laid out her best china tea service, an honor typically reserved for Sunday visitors. The landlady hovered uncertainly, clearly torn between propriety and curiosity. I'll just be in the kitchen if you need anything, she finally said, disappearing reluctantly through the side door. Alone with Asher, Penelope found herself suddenly nervous, though not from fear. There was something about his steady presence that both calmed and unsettled her, like standing at the edge of a precipice and feeling simultaneously secure and exhilarated. You look better this evening, he observed, taking a seat across from her. The swelling has gone down some. Penelope touched her cheek self-consciously. Mrs. Holloway's arnica salve works wonders, though I fear the bruising will take time to fade completely. Your injuries don't diminish you, Asher said quietly. If anything, they speak to your courage." She looked up, startled by his words. "Most would say they speak to my foolishness." "Most people confuse wisdom with convenience," he replied. "It would have been convenient to accept a proposal from a wealthy man. It might even have seemed practical, but it wouldn't have been wise." "You seem very certain of that, for someone who's never met Harold Blackburn." A shadow passed over Asher's face. "I've met men like him before. Men who believe their money or their family name entitles them to whatever or whoever they want." There was something in his voice, a personal edge that made Penelope wonder what experiences had shaped his opinions. Before she could ask, however, another knock came at the door, this one louder, more insistent. Penelope tensed, and Asher rose smoothly to his feet. "Remember," he said softly, "whatever happens next, you have choices. You always have choices." Mrs. Holloway appeared from the kitchen, wringing her hands nervously as she went to answer the door. A moment later, Harold Blackburn's large frame filled the parlor doorway. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his blonde hair slicked back and a bouquet of hothouse flowers clutched in his meaty hand. The smell of whiskey preceded him into the room. His eyes narrowed when he saw Asher. "What's this?" he demanded, looking from the deputy to Penelope. "I came to speak with Miss Vance privately." "Mr. Blackburn," Penelope said, rising carefully to her feet. "Deputy Zimmerman is here in an official capacity." Harold sneered, tossing the flowers onto a side table. "Official capacity? What nonsense is this?" "Assault is a criminal offense in the Wyoming Territory," Asher said calmly. "I'm investigating yesterday's incident." "Incident?" Harold barked a laugh. "Is that what she's calling it? A private disagreement between a man and his intended?" "I am not your intended," Penelope said firmly. "I declined your proposal yesterday, and my answer remains the same today." Harold's face darkened. "My father spoke with you. He explained the situation. I thought you'd have more sense than to persist in this foolishness." "The only foolishness," Asher interrupted, his voice still even, "is thinking that violence against a woman will convince her to marry you." Harold turned his attention fully to Asher, seeming to really see him for the first time. "And who exactly are you?" "Besides a temporary deputy playing at authority." "Someone who understands the law better than you, apparently," Asher replied, unmoved by Harold's belligerence. "And the law says you can't force a woman to marry you, nor can you assault her for refusing." Your father isn't the law," Asher cut him off. "No matter how much influence he has in this town." Harold's face flushed an ugly red, and he took a step toward Asher. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with, stranger." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Asher replied, his hand resting casually near his holster. "The question is, do you?" Something in Asher's steady gaze must have registered with Harold, because he hesitated, glancing between Asher and Penelope with growing frustration. "This is absurd," he finally sputtered. "Penelope, tell this man to leave so we can discuss our future reasonably." "There is no future to discuss, Harold," Penelope said, finding strength in Asher's calm presence. "I won't marry you, not today, not tomorrow, not ever." Harold's expression contorted with rage. "You ungrateful!" He lunged forward. But Asher was faster, stepping between them with such fluid speed that Harold barely had time to register the movement before he found himself face to face with the deputy. "That's enough," Asher said, his voice dangerously soft. "I think it's time for you to leave." "You can't order me around," Harold snarled, though he didn't advance further. "Do you have any idea who my family is in this town?" "I don't care if your father owns the whole damn territory," Asher replied evenly. "You lay another hand on Miss Vance and you'll answer to me, not as a deputy, but as a man who doesn't abide bullies." The two men stared at each other, tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Finally, Harold broke the standoff, stepping back with a bitter laugh. "Keep her then," he spat. "A penniless orphan spinster with delusions of independence. You deserve each other." He turned to Penelope, his eyes cold. "You'll regret this. By this time tomorrow, you'll be without a job or a home in this town." "Perhaps," Penelope acknowledged, her voice steadier than she felt, "but I'll still have my self-respect, something you clearly know nothing about." Harold's face twisted in fury, but Asher stepped forward again, and the larger man thought better of whatever he'd been about to do. With a final venomous glance at them both, he stormed out, slamming the front door so hard that the windows rattled in their frames. In the silence that followed, Penelope found herself trembling uncontrollably, the full impact of what had just happened washing over her. She had defied not only Harold but the entire Blackburn family. By tomorrow, she would likely be unemployed, possibly homeless, and certainly unwelcome in much of Green River. "Sit down before you fall down," Asher said gently, guiding her back to the sofa. He moved to the sideboard where Mrs. Holloway kept a decanter of sherry for medicinal purposes, poured a small glass and brought it to her. "Drink this, slowly." Penelope accepted the glass with shaking hands, taking a small sip of the sweet fortified wine. The warmth spread through her, easing some of the trembling. Asher sat beside her, not touching her but close enough that she could feel the solid reassurance of his presence. "You stood your ground," he said after a moment. "That took courage." "It took your presence," Penelope corrected, taking another sip. "Without you here, I fear the outcome would have been very different." "You underestimate yourself," Asher replied. "But we need to discuss what happens next. Harold's threats weren't idle. The Blackburns will move quickly to make an example of you." Penelope nodded, the reality of her situation settling like a stone in her stomach. "The school board meets tonight. I expect to receive notice of my dismissal by morning. And then, I don't know," she admitted. "I have some savings enough for a stage ticket to Laramie or Cheyenne, perhaps. I could look for a position there." Asher was silent for a moment, studying her face. "There may be another option," he finally said. "One that doesn't involve you running from town to town, always one step ahead of the Blackburns' influence." Penelope looked at him questioningly. "What option is that?" Before he could answer, Mrs. Holloway bustled in, her face pale with anxiety. "Is he gone? I heard shouting, but I didn't dare come in." "He's gone," Asher confirmed, standing. "Though I suspect we haven't heard the last from him or his father." Mrs. Holloway wrung her hands. "This is dreadful, simply dreadful. What will you do, Penelope?" "Where will you go? I don't know yet," Penelope said honestly. "But I'll figure something out." "She won't be alone," Asher added, surprising both women with the certainty in his voice. "Mrs. Holloway, might I have a few more minutes with Miss Vance? There are matters we need to discuss." The landlady looked between them, her expression shifting from concern to something more speculative. "Of course, Deputy, I'll just tidy up in the kitchen." She retreated, closing the parlor door behind her with pointed deliberateness. Alone again, Penelope turned to Asher. "What did you mean, I won't be alone?" Asher sat back down, his expression serious. "Miss Vance, Penelope, there's something I need to tell you. Something that might help explain why I arrived in Green River yesterday, and why I'm so concerned with the Blackburns' behavior." "I'm listening," she said, setting aside the now empty sherry glass. Asher took a deep breath. 3 years ago, my sister Elizabeth lived in Denver. She was a schoolteacher like you. She caught the attention of a wealthy businessman's son, a man named Victor Blackburn. Penelope's eyes widened. "Blackburn? Was he related to Maxwell's nephew?" Asher confirmed grimly. "Same family, same sense of entitlement." Victor pursued Elizabeth relentlessly, despite her clear lack of interest. When she finally refused his proposal outright, Asher's voice tightened. He beat her so severely she was bedridden for weeks. "I'm so sorry," Penelope whispered, instinctively reaching for his hand. Asher's fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. Elizabeth pressed charges, but Victor's father had connections with the local judge. The case was dismissed. 2 months later, Victor confronted her again, drunk and angry. This time, he didn't stop with beating her. Penelope felt sick, understanding the implication. What happened? Elizabeth couldn't live with the shame of it, not in a town where everyone knew and whispered behind their hands. She took her own life 3 days later. Asher's voice was hollow with old grief. "I was away, working as a U.S. Marshal in Arizona Territory. By the time I got the news and returned to Denver, Victor and his father had already left town." "You've been tracking them," Penelope realized. "That's why you're here. You knew the Blackburns in Green River were related to Victor." Asher nodded. "I've spent 3 years building a case against the entire Blackburn family, not just for Elizabeth, but for a dozen other women who suffered similar fates in different territories. The family has branches in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, all operating the same way, using their wealth to control communities and their sons treating women as possessions to be claimed or broken. And yesterday, when you saw me, I saw history repeating itself," Asher said quietly. "I couldn't stand by and watch another woman suffer as my sister did." Penelope absorbed this information slowly, pieces clicking into place. "You're not really a deputy, are you?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "The badge is real enough. I'm still a U.S. Marshal, but I'm working quietly. The Blackburns have friends in high places, including territorial judges and politicians. I need irrefutable evidence of their crimes before I can move officially." "And my assault is part of that evidence," Penelope said, understanding dawning. "It could be," Asher acknowledged. "If you're willing to testify. But I won't lie to you, going up against the Blackburns means putting yourself at risk. They won't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatens their power." "I'm already facing their wrath," Penelope pointed out. "At least this way, it would mean something beyond my own refusal of Harold." Asher studied her face intently. "You understand what you'd be undertaking. It could mean leaving Green River, at least temporarily, possibly facing threats or intimidation." "I understand," Penelope said firmly. "But I also understand what it means to live in fear of a man's anger. My mother did that her entire married life, always walking on eggshells around my father's temper. I swore I would never live that way." She squeezed his hand. "If my testimony can help stop the Blackburns from hurting other women, then I want to help." Something shifted in Asher's expression, respect mingled with something warmer. "You're a remarkable woman, Penelope Vance." "I'm just doing what's right," she replied, though his words sent a pleasant warmth through her chest. "Few have that courage," he said quietly, "especially when facing such powerful enemies." They sat in silence for a moment, hands still joined, each contemplating the path ahead. Finally, Asher spoke again. "We should leave Green River soon, tomorrow if possible. Once the school board meets tonight, the Blackburns will know you're not backing down. They may escalate their tactics." "Where would we go?" Penelope asked. "Cheyenne first." "I have contacts there, other lawmen building cases against different branches of the family. From there, possibly to Denver, where the territorial governor is more sympathetic to our cause." Penelope nodded slowly, the reality of leaving her home of 3 years settling over her. "I'll need to pack my things, say goodbye to my students somehow." "We'll figure it out," Asher promised. "For tonight, though, I think you should stay somewhere other than here. The boarding house is the first place Harold will look if he decides to continue the conversation we started. But where? Sheriff Hollis has a small cabin on the edge of town that he uses for witnesses needing protection. It's not much, but it's secure and private. People will talk, Penelope said uncertainly. A woman staying alone with a man. Mrs. Holloway will accompany us, Asher said promptly. She can act as chaperone until we arrange more permanent travel plans. I suspect she'll be eager to help, especially once she understands the full situation. As if summoned by her name, Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway, her earlier pretense at disinterest abandoned. I couldn't help overhearing, she admitted, not looking particularly ashamed of her eavesdropping. And the deputy is right. The Blackburns are dangerous when crossed. If you're going to stand against them, Penelope, you shouldn't do it alone. Penelope felt a rush of gratitude for the older woman's support. Would you really come with me, Mrs. Holloway, even temporarily? Child, I've been running this boarding house for 40 years, watching men like Maxwell Blackburn bully this town into submission. It's high time someone stood up to them. She turned to Asher. When do we leave? Asher smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. First light tomorrow. The stage for Cheyenne departs at 7. Plans were made quickly after that. Mrs. Holloway would arrange for her sister to watch the boarding house while she was away. Penelope would pack only essential belongings, leaving the rest to be shipped later if necessary. Asher would secure their passage on the morning stage and make arrangements with Sheriff Hollis for the night's accommodations. As darkness fell over Green River, Penelope found herself walking between Asher and Mrs. Holloway toward the small cabin on the town's outskirts, a single valise containing her most important possessions clutched in her hand. The reality of her situation hadn't fully set in yet that she was leaving her home, her job, the life she had built, to embark on an uncertain journey with a man she barely knew, all to bring justice to a family powerful enough to crush her without effort. And yet, despite the danger and uncertainty ahead, Penelope felt more alive than she had in years. For the first time since her parents' death, she wasn't simply surviving day to day, teaching other people's children while watching her own dreams of family and belonging slowly fade. She was fighting for something larger than herself, for justice, for other women who might suffer as she and Elizabeth had, for a world where men like the Blackburns couldn't use their power to harm with impunity. When they reached the cabin, Sheriff Hollis was waiting, a gruff older man with a weathered face and kind eyes. He greeted Asher with the familiar nod of old colleagues, examined Penelope's bruises with a sympathetic grimace, and welcomed Mrs. Holloway like an old friend. Got everything ready, he told them, gesturing to the small but clean interior. Wood for the stove, fresh water, and some basic provisions. I'll keep watch tonight, make sure no one comes nosing around. I appreciate it, John, Asher said, clasping the older man's hand. The sheriff nodded, then turned to Penelope. Miss Vance, I'm sorry about what happened to you, and I'm sorry I wasn't there to prevent it. He looked genuinely pained. The Blackburns have had this town under their thumbs so long, most folks just look the other way. It's not your fault, Sheriff, Penelope assured him. One man can't stand against an entire system. Maybe not, the sheriff agreed, but a few good people working together, that might just be enough to make a difference. He tipped his hat to them all before disappearing into the gathering darkness, the soft jingle of his spurs fading as he walked away. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable, a main room with a cast-iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 4 chairs, and a small bedroom off to one side. Mrs. Holloway immediately took charge, bustling about as she prepared a light supper from the provisions the sheriff had left. You sit and rest, Penelope, she instructed, gesturing to a chair. "Those ribs won't heal if you keep pushing yourself." Too tired to argue, Penelope sank gratefully into the offered seat. Asher remained standing, moving to the window where he could watch the path leading to the cabin, his posture alert despite the casual way he leaned against the wall. "You expect trouble tonight?" Penelope asked quietly. Asher glanced back at her. "I always expect trouble. That way I'm rarely disappointed." Despite the seriousness of his words, there was a warmth in his eyes that made Penelope smile. "That's a rather cynical outlook for a lawman." "I prefer to think of it as practical," he replied, a hint of amusement in his voice. "But to answer your question more directly, I don't think the Blackburns will move against us tonight. They'll be focused on the school board meeting, making sure your dismissal is handled officially. They prefer to maintain a veneer of legitimacy for their actions." "And tomorrow?" Penelope asked. "Tomorrow we'll be on the stage to Cheyenne before they realize we've left town." They ate a simple meal of bread, cheese, and cold ham, conversation flowing more easily than Penelope would have expected given the circumstances. Mrs. Holloway shared stories of Green River's early days, before the Blackburns had consolidated their power. Asher spoke of his travels as a marshal, carefully editing the more dangerous aspects for his audience. Penelope found herself laughing despite her injuries, momentarily forgetting the danger that had driven them to this isolated cabin. As the evening wore on, Mrs. Holloway made up a pallet for herself near the stove, insisting that Penelope take the small bedroom. "I'm too old for a proper bed to make much difference," she declared, waving away Penelope's protests. "These bones have slept on harder ground than this floor." Asher announced he would take the first watch, settling himself in a chair by the window with a clear view of the approach to the cabin. "Get some rest," he told Penelope. "Tomorrow will be a long day." In the small bedroom, Penelope changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, brushing out her long hair. Through the thin door, she could hear Mrs. Holloway's soft snores already rising from the main room, but no sound from Asher. She imagined him sitting vigilant by the window, his gray eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. It was strange how quickly he had become a fixed point in her world, someone she trusted implicitly, despite knowing him for barely 24 hours. Perhaps it was the shared experience of loss and injustice that connected them. Or perhaps it was something more fundamental, a recognition of kindred spirits that transcended time and circumstance. Whatever it was, Penelope found herself drawing strength from his presence as she lay down, pulling the rough woolen blanket up to her chin. Despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, she fell asleep quickly, more peaceful than she had been in days. She woke sometime in the deep night to the soft murmur of voices. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented in the unfamiliar darkness, before remembering where she was. The voices continued Asher and Sheriff Holly's, she realized, speaking in low tones in the main room. "School board voted unanimously to terminate her contract," the sheriff was saying. "Effective immediately. Maxwell made quite a speech about moral standards and proper female behavior." "As expected," Asher's voice replied, tight with controlled anger. "That's not all," Holly's continued. "There's talk of pressing charges against her for defamation of Harold's character. Nothing that would stick in a proper court, but enough to keep her tied up in legal battles if she stays." "Typical Blackburn tactics," Asher muttered. "Use the law as a weapon against anyone who dares stand against them. You need to get her out of here, Asher. The morning stage might be too late. I've arranged for a wagon to take you to the next station at first light. You can catch the stage there, bypassing town entirely." "What about Mrs. Holloway?" She should return to the boarding house as if nothing's amiss. Draw less attention that way. I can arrange for her to follow on the afternoon stage if needed." There was a pause, then Asher asked, "Any word on the federal indictments? Judge Carlton is reviewing the evidence. If Miss Vance's testimony matches the pattern you've established with the other victims, he thinks we might finally have enough to move against the entire family operation." "It has to be airtight," Asher insisted. "These men have escaped justice too many times by exploiting legal technicalities." "I know," Holly sighed. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about your sister. If I'd known Victor was connected to our Blackburns here, I might have—" "You couldn't have known," Asher interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. "None of us understood how extensive their network was until recently. But we'll stop them now, John. For Elizabeth, for Penelope, for all the women who have suffered at their hands." Penelope lay very still, processing what she'd heard. The situation was even more serious than Asher had indicated earlier. Not only had she lost her position, but the Blackburns were now planning legal action against her, a tactic designed to drain her limited resources and ruin her reputation permanently. The door to the bedroom creaked open, and Penelope quickly closed her eyes, feigning sleep. Soft footsteps approached the bed, paused, then retreated. The door closed again with a gentle click. In the darkness, Penelope made a decision. Whatever lay ahead, whatever risk she might face, she would see this through. Not just for herself, but for Elizabeth Zimmerman, whom she had never met but whose fate had so nearly been her own, and for all the other women who had suffered in silence under the Blackburns' reign of entitled cruelty. Dawn broke with a pale golden light filtering through the cabin's small window. Penelope had been awake for over an hour, dressed and packed, sitting on the edge of the bed as she gathered her courage for the journey ahead. When a soft knock came at the door, she was ready. "Miss Vance." Asher called quietly. "The wagon is here." She opened the door to find him looking weary but alert, his eyes taking in her travel-ready appearance with approval. Behind him, Mrs. Holloway was folding the blankets from her makeshift bed, her face pinched with worry. "I heard you talking with the sheriff last night," Penelope admitted, "about the charges and the need to leave immediately." Asher's expression tightened. "You should have been sleeping." "And you should have told me the full extent of the danger," she countered. "I'm not a child to be protected from difficult truths, Asher. If we're going to work together against the Blackburns, you need to trust me with all the information." For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then his expression softened. "You're right. I apologize. Old habits from too many years trying to protect others." "Apology accepted," Penelope said, offering a small smile. "Now about this wagon." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Holloway embraced Penelope tightly, tears in her eyes. "You be careful, my girl. Stand tall and speak the truth, but watch your back every minute. Men like the Blackburns don't play fair." "I will," Penelope promised. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Holloway. I don't know what I would have done without your kindness these past years." The older woman patted her cheek gently. "You would have managed just fine. You're stronger than you know, Penelope Vance." Sheriff Hollies was waiting outside with a small wagon, a sturdy bay horse already hitched and ready. "It's not the most comfortable transportation," he apologized, helping Penelope up onto the wooden seat, "but it'll get you to Sweetwater Station in time for the eastbound stage." Asher loaded their bags into the back before climbing up beside Penelope. The proximity on the narrow seat meant their shoulders touched, a warmth that Penelope found oddly comforting in the cool morning air. "Keep your head down until you reach Cheyenne," Hollies advised, handing Asher the reins. "I've wired ahead to Marshal Bennett. He'll meet you at the station and take you somewhere secure." With final nods of farewell to the sheriff and Mrs. Holloway, Asher clicked his tongue to the horse, and the wagon lurched forward. As they left the outskirts of Green River behind, Penelope looked back at the town where she had spent the last 3 years of her life, the place that had been her home, however tenuous that belonging had sometimes felt. Having second thoughts? Asher asked quietly, noting her backward glance. Penelope shook her head. No, just saying goodbye. They traveled in companionable silence for several miles, the wagon rumbling along the dusty road as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Penelope found herself studying Asher's profile as he drove, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow of concentration between his brows, the way the morning light caught the silver strands in his dark hair. "You're staring," he observed without looking at her, though a hint of amusement colored his voice. Penelope felt her cheeks warm. "I was just thinking that you don't look like my mental image of a U.S. Marshal. And what does a marshal look like in your imagination?" he asked, glancing at her with raised eyebrows. "Older," she admitted. "More weathered, perhaps with an impressive mustache and a perpetual scowl." Asher laughed, the sound surprisingly warm and rich. "I could grow a mustache if it would help my credibility." "Please don't," Penelope replied, finding herself smiling despite the circumstances. "I find your face quite acceptable as it is." As soon as the words left her mouth, she felt herself blush deeper. Asher's eyes crinkled at the corners, but he mercifully changed the subject. "Tell me more about your teaching," he said. "What subjects did you cover?" Grateful for the shift in conversation, Penelope described her work with the children of Green River, the reading and arithmetic lessons, the music instruction that was her particular joy, the small triumphs of watching a struggling student finally master a difficult concept. "You love it," Asher observed. "Teaching isn't just employment for you." "No," she agreed. "It's a calling. Every child deserves the chance to learn, to explore ideas, to imagine possibilities beyond their current circumstances." She sighed, thinking of the students she had left behind. "I hope my replacement cares as much." "Once this is over," Asher said, "you could return to teaching. There are schools in need of dedicated teachers throughout the territories." "If this is ever truly over," Penelope replied, doubt creeping into her voice. The Blackburn seemed so entrenched, so powerful. "No one is beyond the reach of justice forever," Asher said firmly. "It may take time, it may require sacrifice, but the truth has a way of prevailing eventually." His certainty was compelling, and Penelope found herself wanting to believe him, to believe that her current exile from Green River wasn't just an escape, but the first step toward something more important. They reached Sweetwater Station shortly before noon, timing their arrival to coincide with the approach of the eastbound stage. The small way station consisted of little more than a sturdy cabin, a corral for changing horses, and a water trough. The station master, a grizzled older man with only one arm, greeted them with gruff efficiency. "You Sheriff Hollis's friends?" he asked, eyeing them suspiciously. Asher nodded, showing his marshal's badge. "The stage on schedule. Due any minute," the station master confirmed. "Got your tickets waiting inside. Sheriff paid up already." As they waited for the stage, Penelope grew increasingly anxious, glancing repeatedly toward the road behind them. "What if they followed us?" she asked in a low voice. "They didn't," Asher assured her. "Hollis would have warned us." "But even if they suspected something, they'd be watching the Green River Station, not a remote stop like this." The distant rumble of wheels and the jingle of harnesses announced the stage's approach. Moments later, the large Concorde coach appeared around a bend in the road, 6 horses pulling it at a brisk trot. The driver, a weather-beaten man with a magnificent white beard, brought the team to a halt in front of the station. "Changing horses here," he called down. 15 minutes for refreshments if anyone's of a mind. Two passengers disembarked a middle-aged couple who headed straight for the station house, presumably to take advantage of whatever refreshments might be available. Asher used the opportunity to load their bags onto the stage and claim their seats. "We'll be in Cheyenne by nightfall," he told Penelope, helping her into the coach. "It won't be the most comfortable journey, but we should be safe enough on the public stage." The coach was designed to hold 6 passengers, but with only the middle-aged couple joining them, there was room to spread out. Penelope took a seat by the window, grimacing slightly as the motion jostled her still tender ribs. Asher noticed her discomfort immediately. "Here," he said, removing his coat and folding it into a makeshift cushion. "This might help absorb some of the jolts." Penelope accepted the improvised padding with a grateful smile. "Thank you. I'm not usually so delicate, I assure you." "There's nothing delicate about enduring broken ribs," Asher replied seriously. "Most men would be bedridden with such injuries." Before Penelope could respond, the other passengers returned, settling themselves on the opposite seat. The woman, a plump, pleasant-faced person in a sensible traveling dress, smiled warmly at Penelope. "Heading to Cheyenne, dears?" she asked. "Yes," Penelope replied, conscious of Asher's subtle warning glance. "Just a brief visit. We're returning home after visiting our son in Salt Lake City," the woman continued, apparently not noticing Penelope's reticence. "I'm Margaret Wilson, and this is my husband, Thomas. Pleased to meet you," Thomas added with a polite nod. Always nice to have companionship on these long journeys. Penelope introduced herself using only her first name, and Asher followed suit, offering minimal information. If the Wilsons found this odd, they didn't comment, instead launching into a detailed account of their son's successful mercantile business and their 3 grandchildren. The stage lurched into motion, beginning the long journey to Cheyenne. Despite her anxiety and physical discomfort, Penelope found herself drifting off as the rhythmic swaying of the coach and the Wilsons' gentle conversation created a soothing background. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was the solid warmth of Asher's shoulder as she inadvertently leaned against him. She woke to find her head resting fully on his shoulder, his arm carefully positioned to support her without placing pressure on her injured ribs. The light outside the window had changed, suggesting several hours had passed. The Wilsons were dozing across from them, Thomas's head thrown back and emitting soft snores. "Sorry," Penelope murmured, sitting up carefully. "I didn't mean to use you as a pillow." "I didn't mind," Asher replied quietly. "You needed the rest." There was something in his expression as he looked at her, a tenderness that made Penelope's heart beat faster. For a moment, they simply gazed at each other, the rocking motion of the stage creating a strangely intimate bubble around them. "How much further to Cheyenne?" she asked finally, breaking the spell. "Another 3 hours or so," Asher replied, glancing out the window at the passing landscape. "We've made good time despite the road conditions." Penelope nodded, adjusting her position to ease the ache in her side. "What happens when we reach Cheyenne?" "You mentioned a Marshal Bennett, James Bennett," Asher confirmed. "We served together in Arizona. He's been helping coordinate the federal case against the Blackburns. He'll take us to a safe house where you can rest properly while we prepare for your testimony." "And how long will that take?" Asher's expression grew more serious. "That depends on how quickly Judge Carlton processes the evidence and issues the indictments. Could be days, could be weeks." "Weeks," Penelope echoed, the reality of her new circumstances finally sinking in. "I'll need to find work." "I can't just—" "You don't need to worry about that," Asher interrupted gently. "The Marshal's office has funds for protected witnesses. Your needs will be covered." Penelope straightened, a flash of pride straightening her spine despite the pain. I don't accept charity, Asher. I've supported myself since I was 19 years old, and I intend to continue doing so. A smile touched the corners of his mouth. I expected nothing less. We'll find something suitable once you're settled and your injuries have had time to heal. Perhaps private music lessons. Bennett's wife runs a small school for girls in Cheyenne. She might welcome your expertise. The thought was appealing. Teaching had become more than a livelihood for Penelope. It was a core part of her identity, a way of connecting with the world and making a difference in young lives. The idea of continuing that work, even in a new place, eased some of her anxiety about the future. I'd like that, she admitted, though I won't be much use as a piano instructor until my ribs mend. Then consider the first few weeks a well-deserved rest, Asher suggested. When was the last time you took a holiday? Penelope tried to remember. Before my parents died, I suppose. We spent a week at Lake Michigan one summer when I was 17. My mother taught me to swim. Then you're long overdue, Asher said decisively. Though I can't offer Lake Michigan, Cheyenne has its own charms. The remainder of the journey passed more comfortably than Penelope had expected. The Wilsons proved to be pleasant companions, sharing their lunch basket with Penelope and Asher, and regaling them with stories of frontier life without pressing for personal details in return. By the time the stage rolled into Cheyenne in the gathering dusk, Penelope felt almost relaxed despite the uncertainties that awaited her. The Cheyenne Stage Depot was considerably larger and more bustling than Green River's modest station. Gas lamps illuminated a wide yard where several coaches were being serviced, and a two-story building provided accommodations for travelers and offices for the stage line. As they descended from the coach, Asher's hand supportively at her elbow, Penelope noticed a tall man in a dark coat watching them from the edge of the yard. He stepped forward as Asher retrieved their bags from the driver. "Zimmerman," the man greeted, clasping Asher's hand firmly. "Bennett," Asher replied with a nod. "Good to see you." Marshal James Bennett was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard and intelligent eyes that took in Penelope's bruised face with a brief flash of anger before his expression settled back into professional calm. "Miss Vance," he said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully, "I'm sorry for what you've endured. We'll do everything possible to ensure your safety while you're in Cheyenne." "Thank you, Marshal," Penelope replied, impressed by his direct manner. "I appreciate the risks you're taking to help build this case." Bennett nodded, his expression softening slightly. "My wife is waiting with the carriage. She's prepared rooms for you both at our home. It's more secure than a hotel, and Ellen is eager to meet you." They followed Bennett to a waiting carriage where a petite woman with bright eyes and a determined chin sat holding the reins. She smiled warmly as they approached. "You must be Penelope," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Ellen Bennett. Welcome to Cheyenne." Penelope took the offered hand, immediately liking the forthright manner of the marshal's wife. "Thank you for opening your home to us, Mrs. Bennett." "Ellen, please," the woman insisted, "and it's our pleasure. Any friend of Asher's is welcome, especially one brave enough to stand against the Blackburns." The Bennetts lived in a comfortable two-story house on the outskirts of Cheyenne, far enough from the bustle of the town center to offer privacy, but close enough to reach quickly if needed. The interior was warm and inviting, with polished wood floors, simple but elegant furnishings, and the tantalizing smell of something savory cooking in the kitchen. "I've prepared the blue room for you, Penelope," Ellen said, leading the way upstairs. "It has its own washroom, and I've left some liniment for your ribs on the dresser." Asher will be just down the hall in the guest room. The blue room was lovely, spacious, and airy, with a large four-poster bed and windows overlooking a small garden. After the cramped quarters of Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, it felt almost luxurious. "This is very kind," Penelope said, genuinely moved by the thoughtful preparation. Ellen waved away her thanks. "It's the least we can do. James has told me about the case against the Blackburns, what they've done to so many women." She shook her head, indignation flashing in her eyes. It's long past time they faced justice. After showing Penelope where everything was located, Ellen left her to freshen up before dinner. Alone for the first time since leaving Green River, Penelope sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the past 2 days finally catching up with her. She was hundreds of miles from the place she had called home, recovering from a brutal assault and committed to testifying against one of the most powerful families in the territory. And yet, strangely, she didn't feel afraid. Uncertain, yes. Overwhelmed, certainly. But not afraid. Perhaps it was the knowledge that she wasn't facing this alone, that Asher and the Bennetts and others like them were standing with her against the Blackburns' tyranny. Or perhaps, she thought as she changed into the fresh dress Ellen had thoughtfully provided, it was the liberation that came from finally taking a stand after years of careful compromise. Dinner was a pleasant affair, with Ellen proving to be an excellent cook, and James Bennett a surprisingly engaging conversationalist, despite his intimidating appearance. As they ate, the marshal outlined the case they were building against the Blackburn family. "We've documented similar patterns of behavior in 3 territories now," he explained, pushing aside his empty plate. "Sons of the various Blackburn patriarchs targeting independent women, particularly teachers and shopkeepers' women with some standing in the community but limited family connections. When refused, they resort to violence, followed by legal and economic pressure to either force compliance or drive the women from town. In the most severe cases," Asher added grimly, "the women have been found dead, officially ruled as accidents or suicides, but the timing always suspicious." Penelope shivered, thinking how easily she might have become another such statistic. "How have they escaped justice for so long?" "Money," Bennett said bluntly. "Influence, the ability to move between territories when scrutiny becomes too intense in one location. And most critically, the reluctance of witnesses to come forward, either from fear or because they've been paid to remain silent. Which is why your testimony is so valuable," Ellen added, reaching across the table to squeeze Penelope's hand. "You're willing to speak the truth, despite the risks. Judge Carlton believes that with enough corroborating testimonies, we can secure federal indictments against the entire family network," Asher explained. "Not just for the individual assaults, but for conspiracy, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice." "When will I need to testify?" Penelope asked, trying to prepare herself mentally for the ordeal ahead. "Not for a few weeks," Bennett replied. "The judge wants to gather all available evidence before proceeding. In the meantime, you'll need to provide a detailed statement about your experience with Harold Blackburn." "And she needs time to heal," Asher added firmly, his eyes on Penelope's still bruised face. "The judge can wait until she's physically recovered." Bennett nodded in agreement. "Of course. There's no rush, Miss Vance. Your safety and well-being are our priority." After dinner, Ellen showed Penelope to a small parlor where a piano sat in the corner. "James mentioned you're a music teacher," she said. "I thought you might like to play once your hands are feeling better." Penelope approached the instrument reverently, running her fingers lightly over the polished keys. "It's beautiful. Do you play?" Ellen shook her head. "Not a note. The piano was my mother's. I've kept it tuned out of sentiment, but it deserves someone who can truly appreciate it. I'd be honored to play for you when I'm able, Penelope said sincerely. I'd like that, Ellen replied with a warm smile. And speaking of music, I understand from Asher that you might be interested in teaching at my school once you're settled. We have several young ladies who would benefit greatly from musical instruction. Asher mentioned your school, Penelope confirmed. I would love to teach there if you'll have me. Consider yourself hired, Ellen said promptly. We can discuss the details once you're feeling stronger, but I can tell already that you'll be a wonderful addition to our staff. Later, as Penelope prepared for bed in the comfortable blue room, she found herself reflecting on how quickly her life had changed. 3 days ago, she had been a respectable teacher in Green River, living a quiet, predictable life. Now she was a key witness in a federal case, hiding from a powerful family and starting over in a new city. And yet, despite all the upheaval and uncertainty, she felt strangely at peace. Perhaps it was the knowledge that she was finally taking action against the kind of injustice her mother had suffered silently for years. Or perhaps it was the unexpected sense of connection she felt with Asher, a man who understood both justice and loss in ways few others could. Whatever the reason, as Penelope drifted toward sleep in the unfamiliar bed, she found herself looking forward to the morning for the first time in longer than she could remember. The next few weeks passed in a gentle rhythm, as Penelope recovered from her injuries under Ellen's motherly care and Asher's watchful protection. The bruises on her face faded slowly, transforming from angry purple to greenish yellow before disappearing entirely. Her ribs took longer to heal, but gradually the sharp pain subsided to a dull ache, and finally to just an occasional twinge when she moved too quickly. During this time, Penelope provided her formal statement about Harold Blackburn's assault, dictating the details to a court stenographer while Asher and Marshall Bennett listened with controlled anger. The process was painful but cathartic, allowing her to transform her private humiliation into documented evidence against her attacker. As her physical strength returned, Penelope began spending time at Ellen's school, initially just observing classes, but eventually offering music instruction to the eager young students. The school was small but well respected, providing education to the daughters of Cheyenne's merchants, ranchers, and professional men. Ellen had established it 5 years earlier after recognizing the limited opportunities available to girls in the territory, and she ran it with a combination of strict academic standards and progressive ideas that Penelope found deeply appealing. Most schools teach girls just enough to make them decorative wives, Ellen explained one afternoon as they watched the students practicing their music. I want our girls to be capable of independence, whether they choose marriage or not. It's a radical notion in these parts, Penelope observed, thinking of the limited expectations placed on women in Green River. Ellen's eyes sparkled with determination. All meaningful change begins as a radical notion, my dear. 20 years ago, women owning property was radical. 10 years ago, women teaching was considered suspect. Change comes, but never without those willing to push for it. Throughout these weeks, Asher remained a constant presence, though his duties often took him away during the day. He was working closely with Bennett and other federal officials, gathering evidence and preparing for the coming legal battle against the Blackburns. Each evening he would return to the Bennett home for dinner, where the conversation inevitably turned to the progress of the case. We've located 2 more witnesses in Montana territory, he reported one night in late October, nearly a month after their arrival in Cheyenne. Women who were assaulted by Jeffrey Blackburn, Maxwell's brother, after refusing his advances. Bennett is arranging for their safe transport to Cheyenne. How many victims have come forward now? Ellen asked, passing a platter of roasted potatoes. 11, Asher replied, his expression grim. Spanning 15 years and 3 territories, and those are just the women brave enough to testify. We suspect there are dozens more who are still too afraid or who have been paid for their silence. Penelope felt a chill at the scope of the Blackburn's predation. How is it possible that this has continued for so long without consequences? The Blackburns are careful, Bennett explained, joining the conversation. They choose vulnerable women, usually without male relatives to protect them. They use their wealth and connections to discredit any accusations. And they don't hesitate to resort to intimidation or worse if someone persists in speaking out. Like your sister, Penelope said softly, looking at Asher. A shadow passed over his face. Yes, like Elizabeth. After dinner, while Ellen and James cleared the dishes, Asher invited Penelope to join him for a walk in the garden. The October evening was cool but pleasant, the setting sun casting long shadows across the well-tended paths. "You're looking better," Asher observed as they strolled side by side. "The color has returned to your face." "I feel better," Penelope agreed, strong enough to return to teaching properly. "Ellen has been wonderfully patient with my limited hours." "She thinks very highly of you," Asher said, "as do her students." "I overheard little Miss Morgan telling her mother you were the best music teacher she'd ever had." Penelope smiled, warmed by the compliment. "The girls are a delight to teach, so eager to learn, so full of possibilities." She paused, then added more seriously, "I'm grateful for this new start, Asher. Despite the circumstances that brought me here, I feel purposeful again." "I'm glad," he said simply, his gray eyes warm as they met hers. They walked in comfortable silence for a few moments before Asher spoke again, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "Judge Carlton has set a date for the initial hearing. 2 weeks from now, he'll review the evidence and decide whether to issue federal indictments against the Blackburn family." Penelope nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "Will I need to testify at this hearing?" "Yes," Asher confirmed, "but it will be a closed proceeding, just the judge, the prosecutors, and essential witnesses. The Blackburns' lawyers will be present, but the family themselves won't be allowed in the courtroom while witnesses are speaking. And if the judge issues the indictments, then we move to a formal trial, which could take months to prepare." Asher studied her face carefully. "Are you having second thoughts?" Penelope shook her head firmly. "No, I'm nervous, of course. Anyone would be. But I'm committed to seeing this through, Asher. For Elizabeth, for the other women, and for myself." Relief softened his expression. "You continue to surprise me, Penelope Vance. Most people in your position would have taken the first train back east by now." "Perhaps I'm not most people," she replied with a small smile. "No," he agreed, his voice dropping lower. "You most certainly are not." There was something in his tone that made Penelope's heart beat faster. They had stopped walking and now stood facing each other in the deepening twilight. Asher was looking at her with an intensity that sent warmth spreading through her body despite the cool evening air. "Penelope," he began, then hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "These past weeks, getting to know you, watching your courage and your kindness, I find myself thinking of you in ways that go beyond my professional responsibilities." Penelope felt her breath catch. "In what ways?" she asked softly. Asher took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "In ways that make me question whether I should continue as your protector. In ways that make me wonder what might be possible between us when this is all over." "And what do you think might be possible?" Penelope whispered, hardly daring to hope that he felt the same growing attraction she had been trying to ignore for weeks. Instead of answering with words, Asher reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished, and gently cupped her cheek in his palm. Penelope leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his as he lowered his head and brushed his lips against hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. It was brief, just the lightest pressure of his mouth against hers, but it sent a current of sensation through Penelope's body that left her dizzy with longing. When Asher pulled back, his eyes were dark with emotion. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, though he made no move to step away. "Not while you're under my protection, not while the case is ongoing." "I'm glad you did," Penelope replied honestly. "I've been wondering what it would be like to be kissed by you." A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Have you now?" "For some time," she admitted, feeling her cheeks warm with the confession. "Though I told myself it was impossible, that you only saw me as a witness, a responsibility." "Never just a responsibility," Asher said, his voice rough with feeling. "From the moment I saw you in Green River, trying to gather your papers with such dignity despite your injuries, I felt drawn to you. Your strength, your determination, your kindness with your students, all of it called to something in me I thought had died with Elizabeth." Penelope's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "What was that?" "Hope," he said simply. "Hope that justice is possible. Hope that goodness can prevail over cruelty. Hope that life might still hold joy even after such loss." Moved beyond words, Penelope reached up to touch his face, tracing the scar that ran from temple to jaw. "I feel it too," she whispered. "This connection between us. But you're right, the timing is complicated. The case must come first." Asher turned his head to press a kiss into her palm. "The case will end, Penelope. And when it does, if you're willing, I'd like to court you properly. Not as a marshal protecting a witness, but as a man who admires and respects a remarkable woman." "I'd like that very much," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. They walked back to the house hand in hand, both understanding that what had begun between them must remain on hold until their more pressing duties were fulfilled. But as they parted in the hallway outside their rooms, Asher's fingers lingering on hers until the last possible moment, Penelope felt a certainty she had never experienced before, that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The day of the hearing arrived with a crisp November chill in the air. Penelope woke early, her nerves making sleep impossible as the enormity of what she was about to do settled over her. Today, she would face not only the memory of Harold Blackburn's violence, but also the skeptical scrutiny of a federal judge and the hostile questioning of the Blackburns' lawyers. Ellen helped her dress in a severe but elegant navy blue dress that conveyed both respectability and seriousness of purpose. As Penelope pinned up her hair in a neat chignon, she studied her reflection in the mirror. The physical evidence of Harold's attack had faded entirely, leaving no visible scars on her face. The real marks were deeper, carried within her memories and emotions, but those too had begun to heal during her time in Cheyenne. "You look perfect," Ellen said, adjusting the lace at Penelope's collar. "Dignified and composed, exactly the impression we want to make on Judge Carlton." "I just hope my voice doesn't shake when I speak," Penelope admitted, smoothing her skirts nervously. "If it does, it only shows you're human," Ellen replied practically. "The judge doesn't expect you to be unaffected by what happened to you. He only expects you to tell the truth." Downstairs, Asher and James were waiting in the parlor, both dressed in formal suits that transformed them from rugged lawmen to impressive federal officials. Asher's eyes warmed when he saw Penelope, though he maintained a professional distance in front of the Bennetts. "Ready," he asked simply. Penelope nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. The federal courthouse in Cheyenne was an imposing stone building in the center of town, its high windows and columned entrance designed to inspire respect for the law it represented. As their carriage approached, Penelope noticed several other vehicles already parked outside, including an expensive private coach emblazoned with a familiar crest. "The Blackburns are already here," she said, unable to keep the tension from her voice. "Just their lawyers," Asher assured her. "Maxwell and Harold are required to remain outside the courtroom during witness testimony." Inside, they were escorted to a small waiting room where several other women sat in nervous silence. Penelope recognized them from Bennett's descriptions, the victims who had come forward from other territories, each bearing her own story of Blackburn cruelty. One by one, they were called to testify, each disappearing through the heavy wooden doors into the courtroom and returning some time later, usually pale but relieved. Penelope was the last to be summoned, perhaps because her experience was the most recent. When her name was finally called, Asher squeezed her hand briefly. "Remember," he said quietly, "just tell the truth. Your words have power." The courtroom was smaller than Penelope had imagined, with dark wood paneling and heavy velvet drapes that gave it an almost claustrophobic atmosphere. Judge Carlton, a thin man with piercing blue eyes and a shock of white hair, sat behind a raised desk, watching her intently as she was sworn in. To one side sat several men in expensive suits, the Blackburns' lawyers. She presumed their expressions a calculated mixture of skepticism and condescension. On the other side were the federal prosecutors, including James Bennett, their faces encouraging as she took her seat in the witness chair. For the next 2 hours, Penelope answered questions about her relationship with Harold Blackburn, his proposal, her refusal, and the subsequent assault. She described the public beating, the threats against her employment, and the pressure to accept a proposal she had already rejected. Through it all, she kept her voice steady, her eyes fixed on the judge rather than the sneering lawyers who tried to suggest she had provoked Harold's anger or misinterpreted his actions. "So you admit you refused Mr. Blackburn without proper consideration of his offer?" one lawyer asked, his tone implying she had committed some grave social error. "I considered his offer and found it lacking," Penelope replied evenly. "I did not love him, nor did I respect his character. Those were sufficient reasons for refusal." "And you felt no obligation to show gratitude for the interest of a man of Mr. Blackburn's standing?" the lawyer persisted. Penelope met his gaze directly. "A woman's hand in marriage is not a reward for a man's social position or financial success, sir. It is a choice freely given out of love and mutual respect. I owed Mr. Blackburn nothing more than the honesty of my refusal." A ghost of a smile touched Judge Carlton's stern mouth at her response. "Well said, Miss Vance." By the time Penelope was finally dismissed, she was exhausted but oddly exhilarated. She had spoken her truth without flinching, had faced the legal representatives of the family that had sought to control her, and had emerged with her dignity intact. As she left the courtroom, she found Asher waiting in the hallway, his face tight with concern until he saw her expression. "You did well," he said, the pride in his voice warming her better than any praise from the judge. "How do you know?" she asked. "You weren't in the courtroom." A smile touched his lips. "Bennett sent me a note. He said you were magnificent and that the judge was clearly impressed by your testimony." One of the Blackburn lawyers tried to suggest I should have been grateful for Harold's attention, Penelope said, still indignant at the implication. "And what did you tell him?" Asher asked, offering his arm as they walked toward the exit. Penelope repeated her response, and Asher laughed softly. I would have paid good money to see that lawyer's face. They joined the other witnesses in the main hall, where Bennett was explaining the next steps in the process. Judge Carlton will review all the evidence and testimonies before making his decision, he told the assembled women. It may take several days, but I'm cautiously optimistic. Your courage in coming forward has provided him with compelling evidence of a pattern of abuse that spans years and crosses territorial boundaries. What happens if he issues the indictments? Asked one of the women, a slender blonde whose hands trembled visibly despite her composed expression. Federal warrants will be issued for the arrest of Maxwell Blackburn and his brothers, along with their sons who have been implicated in specific assaults, Bennett explained. They'll be brought to Cheyenne to stand trial, which would likely take place early next year. And we'll all have to testify again. Another woman asked anxiously. Bennett nodded sympathetically. Yes, but this time with the full protection of the federal court. The Blackburns will be in custody during the trial, unable to threaten or intimidate any witnesses. The women exchanged nervous glances, clearly weighing the toll of another round of public testimony against the promise of justice. Penelope understood their hesitation. She too dreaded facing Harold across a crowded courtroom, but the alternative was allowing the Blackburns to continue their reign of terror unchecked. I'll be there, she said firmly, looking around at the other women. However long it takes, whatever it requires, they can't be allowed to hurt anyone else. Her words seemed to strengthen the resolve of the other witnesses. One by one, they nodded in agreement, a shared determination binding them together despite their diverse backgrounds and experiences. The next 3 days were among the longest of Penelope's life, as she waited for news of Judge Carlton's decision. She continued teaching at Ellen's school, finding solace in the familiar rhythms of music instruction and the uncomplicated joy of her students. Asher was frequently absent, working with Bennett to prepare for the possible arrests, but each evening he would return to the Bennett home with updates on the case. On the third day, as Penelope was finishing a piano lesson with one of her more talented students, Ellen appeared in the doorway of the music room, her face alight with excitement. It's happened, she said breathlessly. The judge has issued the indictments. James just sent word from the courthouse. Penelope's heart leaped. All of them. Even Harold, Ellen nodded. The entire family leadership. 27 indictments in total, covering everything from assault to conspiracy to obstruction of justice. James says it's unprecedented in territorial history. The news spread quickly through Cheyenne, dominating conversations in shops and saloons as people debated the implications of such high-profile arrests. By dinner that evening, reports were already circulating about federal marshals dispatched to Green River, Billings, and Helena to apprehend the various Blackburn patriarchs and their sons. Asher arrived late to dinner, his face drawn with fatigue but his eyes bright with satisfaction. It's done, he told them, accepting a glass of whiskey from Bennett with a grateful nod. Maxwell and Harold Blackburn were taken into custody this afternoon in Green River. They're being transported to Cheyenne as we speak. Any resistance? Bennett asked, pouring drinks for everyone to celebrate the momentous occasion. Not from Maxwell, Asher replied. He's too shrewd to fight federal marshals, but Harold had to be physically restrained. He was ranting about conspiracies and threatening everyone involved in the case. Penelope felt a chill despite the warmth of the dining room. Will he be secure when they reach Cheyenne? Asher's expression softened as he looked at her. Completely. They'll be held in the federal detention facility under constant guard until the trial. Harold won't have the opportunity to harm you or anyone else. Later that evening, after Ellen and James had retired, Asher found Penelope in the parlor, seated at the piano though she wasn't playing. The soft lamplight cast a golden glow over her features as she stared thoughtfully at the silent keys. "Penny for your thoughts," he said quietly, using the affectionate shortening of her name that had emerged during their weeks together. Penelope looked up, a small smile touching her lips. "I was thinking about Green River, about my students, about Mrs. Holloway, wondering how they're reacting to the Blackburns' arrest. According to the marshals who made the arrests, the town is in shock," Asher said, taking a seat beside her on the piano bench. Few could believe that federal authorities would move against such powerful men, but there were also those who seemed relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from the entire community. "I can imagine," Penelope murmured. "The Blackburns cast a long shadow over that town." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, shoulders touching lightly before Asher spoke again. "What will you do now? Will you return to Green River once the trial is over?" Penelope considered the question carefully. "I don't think so," she said finally. "Not permanently, at least. I've found something here in Cheyenne that I never quite had in Green River." "And what's that?" Asher asked, his voice soft. "A sense of purpose beyond just earning my keep," she replied, turning slightly to face him. "Ellen's school. The girls I'm teaching, they represent a different vision of what education can be. Not just reading and arithmetic, but preparation for real independence, for lives determined by choice rather than circumstance." She paused, then added more quietly, "And there are other reasons to stay, too." Asher's eyes held her steadily. "What other reasons?" "You," Penelope said simply. "Us. Whatever this might become, given the chance to grow outside the shadow of the case." Something in Asher's face shifted, tension giving way to a tentative hope. "I was afraid to ask," he admitted. "Afraid you might associate me too strongly with the worst experience of your life. That once the danger passed, you'd want to leave all reminders of it behind, including me." Penelope reached for his hand, twining her fingers through his. "You were never part of the trauma, Asher. From the moment you saw me gathering my scattered papers in the street, you've been part of the healing." She smiled softly. "You were the one who told me I could choose who I love, how I live, what I become. That gift of choice is something I'll never forget or take for granted." Asher's fingers tightened around hers. "I meant every word, and I meant what I said in the garden that night. When this is over, when the trial is done and the Blackburns are facing justice, I want to court you properly, Penelope Vance. Because I'm falling in love with you, and I hope you might be feeling the same." "I am," she whispered, her heart so full it felt like it might overflow. "I've been falling in love with you since Green River, though I hardly dared admit it even to myself." The kiss that followed was deeper than their first, filled with promise and certainty, and a passion that had been held in careful check for too long. Asher's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as Penelope's hands found their way to his shoulders, then his neck, then into his dark hair. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, Asher rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably wait until after the trial," he said, his voice rough with restrained desire. "For propriety's sake, if nothing else." Penelope laughed softly. "Always the honorable man." She brushed another quick kiss across his lips before pulling back. "But you're right. The trial comes first, justice for Elizabeth and all the others. Then us." "Then us," Asher agreed, his eyes alight with a happiness Penelope suspected had been absent for many years. The trial of the Blackburn family began in January of 1876, drawing attention from newspapers as far away as Denver and Salt Lake City. The federal courthouse in Cheyenne was packed daily with spectators eager to witness the unprecedented proceedings against such powerful men. For Penelope, the trial was both exhausting and empowering. She testified on the third day, walking past the Blackburn men seated at the defense table with her head held high. Harold glared at her with undisguised hatred, but Penelope kept her eyes fixed on the jury as she recounted, once again, the events that had brought her to this moment. The Blackburns' lawyers tried their best to discredit her and the other women who testified, suggesting they were colluding for financial gain or personal vendettas. But the pattern established by so many similar stories from different territories was too compelling to dismiss. When physical evidence was presented, including Penelope's torn and blood-stained dress from the day of the assault, carefully preserved by Mrs. Holloway, even the most skeptical jurors seemed moved. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury took less than a day to reach their verdict. Guilty on all counts for Maxwell, Harold, and 5 other Blackburn men. The sentences handed down by Judge Carlton were severe 15 to 20 years in federal prison for the patriarchs who had orchestrated the family's reign of terror, and 8 to 12 years for the sons who had carried out the assaults. As Harold was led from the courtroom in chains, he turned to spit a final venomous threat at Penelope. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Not by a long shot." Asher stepped forward immediately, placing himself between Penelope and Harold's hate-filled gaze. "Yes, Blackburn," he said evenly. "It is." The marshals dragged Harold away, his continued threats fading as the heavy doors closed behind him. In the silence that followed, Asher turned to Penelope, taking her hands in his. "It's done," he said simply. "They can't hurt anyone else now." Tears filled Penelope's eyes, not of fear or pain, but of relief and vindication. "I keep thinking of Elizabeth," she whispered. "I wish she could have seen this day." "She did," Asher said softly, his own eyes bright with emotion. "Through you, through all of you who had the courage to speak the truth. She saw it." In the weeks that followed the trial, life gradually settled into a new pattern. Penelope continued teaching at Ellen's school, now with an expanded program of music instruction that drew students from throughout Cheyenne. Asher, his mission against the Blackburns completed, accepted a permanent position with the U.S. Marshal's office in Wyoming Territory, allowing him to remain in Cheyenne. True to his word, he courted Penelope with formal propriety, calling at the small house she had rented near the school with flowers and invitations to concerts or dinners at respectable establishments. They were often joined by the Bennetts, whose friendship had become a cornerstone of their lives in Cheyenne. As spring arrived, bringing new growth and warmth to the high plains, Asher invited Penelope for a Sunday afternoon ride into the countryside. They followed a winding trail through rolling hills carpeted with early wildflowers until they reached a small, sheltered valley where a creek bubbled over smooth stones. "It's beautiful here," Penelope said as Asher helped her down from her horse. "How did you find this place?" "I've been exploring the territory whenever my duties allow," he replied, spreading a blanket on a grassy spot beside the creek. "I wanted somewhere special for today." There was something in his voice that made Penelope's heart beat faster. As they settled on the blanket and unpacked the picnic lunch Ellen had helped prepare, she noticed Asher seemed uncharacteristically nervous, his usual steady confidence replaced by a subtle tension. After they had eaten, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the creek and the birds singing in the nearby trees, Asher took her hand, his expression suddenly serious. "Penelope," he began, "these past months have been the happiest of my life. After Elizabeth died, I thought I would never find joy again, that my life would be defined solely by the pursuit of justice and duty. But then I met you, standing defiant despite your injuries, refusing to be broken by cruelty, and something inside me woke up again. Penelope squeezed his hand, her throat tight with emotion. You changed my life too, Asher. You showed me that standing up for myself wasn't just about personal dignity, it was about justice for others too. You helped me find purpose and strength I didn't know I had. Asher smiled, reaching to brush a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. We've been through darkness together, you and I. We've faced the worst of humanity and emerged stronger for it. But now I want to build something different with you, something filled with light and hope and joy. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, and Penelope's breath caught as she realized what was happening. Opening the box, he revealed a delicate gold ring set with a single perfect pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. Penelope Vance, Asher said, his voice steady now despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I love you with everything I am. You are the bravest, kindest, most remarkable woman I have ever known. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Tears of happiness spilled down Penelope's cheeks as she nodded, too overcome for words at first. Yes, she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Asher Zimmerman, I will marry you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Asher's face was transformed by a smile of such pure joy that it made Penelope's heart ache with love for him. When he kissed her, it felt like a promise not just of the life they would build together, but of all they had already overcome to reach this moment. They were married on a perfect June day in the garden behind the Bennett home, surrounded by friends who had become family during their time in Cheyenne. Ellen had decorated the space with wildflowers and ribbons, creating a natural cathedral beneath the blue Wyoming sky. Mrs. Holloway traveled from Green River for the occasion, bringing with her several of Penelope's former students who performed a special musical piece they had practiced secretly for the event. As Penelope walked toward Asher, wearing a gown of ivory satin with pearl buttons that matched her engagement ring, she felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. The man waiting for her beneath an arch of roses was more than just the love of her life. He was the embodiment of justice and honor, and the promise that even after great suffering, joy was still possible. You are so beautiful, Asher whispered as she reached him, his eyes shining with love and wonder. So are you, she replied softly, taking his outstretched hands. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful, with vows they had written themselves that acknowledged both the darkness they had overcome and the light they had found in each other. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the gathered friends erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to echo the joy bursting in Penelope's heart. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and laughter filling the Bennett garden. As twilight fell and lanterns were lit among the trees, Asher led Penelope away from the festivities for a moment of quiet together. "Happy, Mrs. Zimmerman?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist as they stood in the shadows of the garden. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Penelope replied, leaning into his embrace. "And you, Marshal Zimmerman?" "I have everything I could ever want right here," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "A brave, beautiful wife, good friends, meaningful work, and a future filled with possibilities." "What possibilities do you see?" Penelope asked, curious about his dreams now that the mission that had driven him for so long was complete. Asher's eyes were thoughtful in the gathering darkness. "I see us building a home here in Cheyenne. I see you continuing to teach and inspire young women at Ellen's school. Perhaps someday we might have children of our own, little ones with your courage and determination." "And your sense of justice," Penelope added, imagining children with Asher's storm-gray eyes and steadfast character. "I'd like that very much." "Whatever the future holds," Asher said, drawing her closer, "we'll face it together. The good and the bad, the joy and the sorrow, all of it shared between us." "Together," Penelope agreed, rising on tiptoe to kiss him beneath the starlit Wyoming sky, her heart full of gratitude for the man who had seen her tears and reminded her that she alone could choose whom to love. In the years that followed, Penelope and Asher built the life they had imagined on that wedding day. They established a comfortable home on the outskirts of Cheyenne, with rooms filled with books and music and the laughter of friends. Penelope continued teaching at Ellen's school, eventually becoming co-headmistress when Ellen decided to focus on expanding the curriculum to include more practical skills for young women. Asher's work as a marshal took him away occasionally, but never for long, and he always returned to Penelope with the same look of wonder in his eyes that he'd had on their wedding day, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune in finding her. In the spring of 1878, their family grew with the birth of their son, Thomas James Zimmerman, a sturdy boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth Ellen Zimmerman, named for the sister Asher had lost and the friend who had become like family to them both. The Blackburns remained in federal prison, their influence diminished but not entirely forgotten. Occasionally, rumors would reach Cheyenne of threats made by Harold against those who had testified against him, but the years passed without incident, and gradually the fear of reprisal faded from Penelope's thoughts. On a warm autumn afternoon in 1883, as Penelope sat on the porch of their home watching 5-year-old Thomas teaching his little sister how to build a fort from fallen branches, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of contentment. From the orphaned music teacher standing bloodied in the street of Green River to the respected educator and beloved wife and mother, she had become it had been a path marked by both terrible darkness and extraordinary light. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention, and she smiled as Asher appeared, returning from his duties in town. Even after 7 years of marriage, the sight of him still quickened her heart. "Papa!" The children cried in unison, abandoning their fort building to race toward their father as he dismounted. Asher scooped them both up, one in each arm, spinning them around as they shrieked with delight. "Have you two been good for your mama today?" he asked, carrying them back toward the porch where Penelope waited. "Tommy showed me how to make a real fort," Elizabeth announced proudly, "just like the ones you slept in when you were chasing bad men. Is that so?" Asher replied, his eyes meeting Penelope's over their daughter's head, shared amusement at the child's imagination lighting both their faces. "Well, I can't wait to see it." He set the children down, sending them back to their project with promises to inspect their work shortly, before climbing the porch steps to greet his wife properly. "Hello, beautiful," he said softly, bending to kiss her with a tenderness that 7 years had only deepened. "Hello yourself," Penelope replied, making room for him on the swing beside her. "Good day." "Better now," he said, settling next to her and taking her hand in his. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching their children play in the golden afternoon light, before Asher spoke again. "I received a letter from the federal prison today. Harold Blackburn died last week. Fever, apparently." Penelope absorbed this news slowly, searching her heart for her reaction. There was no joy in the death of another human being, even one who had caused such pain, but she couldn't deny the sense of closure it brought. "How do you feel about it?" she asked, knowing that for Asher, the news might carry more complex emotions given his long pursuit of justice against the family. Asher was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Relieved, mostly," he finally said. "Not that he's dead specifically, but that this chapter is truly closed now. That you and the children never need worry about him again." Penelope leaned her head against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I stopped being afraid of Harold Blackburn a long time ago," she said softly. "The day you told me I could choose who to love, that was the day I began to reclaim my power from men like him." Asher pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You always had that power, Penny. I just reminded you of it." "Perhaps," she conceded with a small smile. "But having someone believe in your strength makes it easier to believe in it yourself." She turned to look at him directly, taking in the face she had loved for so many years, the storm-gray eyes, the lines of character that had deepened with time, the scar that told its own story of survival. "Thank you for being that person for me, Asher. For seeing me at my worst moment and still recognizing something worth fighting for." "Always," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "Always and forever." As the sun began to set over the Wyoming plains, casting long golden shadows across their little piece of the world, Penelope Zimmerman sat surrounded by the family she had built from courage and love and second chances. The path that had brought her here had not been easy or straight, but looking at her husband and children, at the life they had created together, she knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't change a single step of the journey. For in choosing love over fear, truth over silence, and hope over despair, she had found not just safety or comfort, but the deepest kind of happiness, one built on her own terms, with a man who had always believed she had the right to choose.